evening and welcome to another episode of Vantage Point. I'm Nadim Majid, joining us as usual, Dr. Dan Jayathilaka. Dr. Jayathilaka, thank you very much for being on the program once again.
Hi.
I'd like to start off by asking you about the unrest that we saw over the weekend in Alutgama and in Beruwala as well. Dr. Jayathilaka, the question that I want to ask you is, now Sri Lanka is facing an international investigation from the UN Human Rights Council. How will incidents such as the events that unfolded in Alutgama and Beruwala affect that process?
Well, Nadim, if some enemy of Sri Lanka, among those who lobbied for the resolution and the investigation, wanted to really put Sri Lanka in a great deal of trouble, I can't think of anything better than what has happened and what is happening in terms of the communal or religious clashes, violence, the scenes of places on fire that we have been witnessing over the last few days. Now, after July 83, I would have thought that Sri Lankans of all communities had learnt the lesson. But evidently not. Now, certainly things are not on that scale, but things could spiral out of control. And secondly, the threshold of tolerance of the world is much less for this sort of thing in the 21st century than it was in the 20th century. July 83 was, as you would recall, a watershed in that it is after July 83 that a small insurgent movement ballooned, and the Sri Lankan ethnic crisis, as it was known, or the ethnic conflict, became internationalized. And it has remained internationalized even after the war has been won 5 years ago. The effects of July 83 have not gone away. If there were no July 83, we wouldn't be in the international situation that we are today. Now, if there is anything remotely resembling that or which renews memories of that, it doesn't have to be in relation to one community, it can be in relation to another minority. Then the entire image of Sri Lanka and the consequences for us as a country are very, very serious.
Dr. Jayathilaka, you were talking about world tolerance. Let's talk about the level of tolerance here domestically for issues like this. Do you think that things like this will continue to happen in the future because there is as certain parties would put it, level of tolerance for for incitement?
Well, there's a high level of tolerance for intolerance. We hear the phrase zero tolerance, but there's no policy of zero tolerance towards incitement of hatred towards communities. Now, the sort of incidents at the street level, community on community, young people on young people, that happens in various parts of the world. But the state moves in then. The law enforcement apparatus, the security apparatus moves in, and the country as a whole, the communities, both communities or all communities see that the state is a neutral umpire. Now, has that been the case in Sri Lanka in the recent past? Well, concerning Grand Pass, I think things were not too bad. But I'm not sure about other situations. Now, let's take how these things unfold or have unfolded in this particular case.
Well, soon after this incident, the president, who was at the G77 summit in Bolivia, almost fairly quickly, I believe later in the night, about 10 or 11 in the night, there was a message on Twitter from the president who said that this kind of thing will not be tolerated, and that people will not be allowed to take the law into their own hands. Do you see that as a positive reaction?
Well, it's a positive reaction.
And more than reaction, do you see it being put into action?
Well, that remains to be seen, because it's much better than the response or lack of it of President Jayawardena in July 83. There was complete silence. You didn't know that there was a president. This was also the case in 1958 with Mr. Bandaranaike until he went on the radio belatedly. So President Rajapaksa has been fast off the mark. Now that's a plus factor, but there are minus factors as well, because it could be asked, as it was asked about President Jayawardena, and indeed about Prime Minister S.W.R.D. Bandaranaike in relation to 58, whether or not there was a degree of impunity and immunity accorded to extremist forces under the umbrella or with the tacit support or tolerance or patronage of the state or the government. Now, this was asked about President Jayawardena because of the Cyril Matthew phenomenon, where a senior minister and the head of the UNP's trade union wing was one of the most vociferous anti-Tamil elements at that time. I also recall that during the anti-Tamil riots of July 83, mobs, including those in robes, used Mahabali board vehicles. So the question arises as to whether the state had acted adequately in the recent past to crack down on organizations that were openly engaging in hate speech towards various minority communities in the country. Now, this kind of hate speech has been indulged in. It's on video, it's on television, at least since 2012. Now, what was done about that? What is happening now in
Dr. Jayathinka, what I would like to ask you is, our law enforcement equipped with the legislation to take action?
Oh yes, I mean the legislation exists. Nobody can break the law. And it's not just legislation.
To tackle this issue of hate speech particularly.
Well, yes, Nadeem, there are those who debate whether or not such organizations should be banned. I'm opposed to banning or proscription. My point is much simpler. If you have a situation on the ground, and when you have a situation on the ground in which there has been some incident, the police should go and investigate and arrest or question the suspects concerned. What you should not do, and what, however, seems to have happened.
This is where I'm a bit lost as to the approach of the law enforcement agencies. I mean, we've seen them obtain court orders for numerous protests by student organizations.
Absolutely.
From Fort Magistrate, the Allied Health Science undergraduates when that
exactly.
I mean, so they were anticipating some sort of trouble.
Yeah, I think there's a student leader who's in and out of police stations, one of the inter-university...
Mr. Najit Indika, I believe, a bit.
No, there's another guy, Chamar. Anyway, there's this young fellow whom I see, he's constantly... they should install a revolving door in one of these police stations, because he's in and out of those police stations.
Yeah.
This is an inter-university student federation guy. I don't know whether he belongs to the JVP or the FSP or neither, but he's the favorite suspect when they have to round up suspects. But when there is a rally held in a situation where there's tension on the ground, and at that rally there are blood-curdling speeches threatening elimination, extermination, the end of a community, and so on and so forth. My question is not why wasn't the organization banned. My question is why was permission given for that rally, and who gave it. And when after the rally you see flames rising, then you know that it has had, shall we say, an incendiary effect.
Well, both literally and metaphorically.
Why was permission given? Who by? Is it perhaps that there was a perception that this organization somehow has been seen to be associated with or in the company of exalted people, and therefore law enforcement and local authorities are wary, they are reluctant, they think these guys are connected. They've got patronage. That may not be true, but it's a perception.
I think that's the thing. I think to me it appears like law enforcement is acting under certain assumptions in this case, and I think that if I were to put it to you that incidents like this display more than anything else, displays weakness in law enforcement and the rule of law in the country.
Well, Nadeem, it makes a very good case for bringing back the 17th Amendment. Not for abolishing the presidency, but for bringing back the 17th Amendment. And I say not for abolishing the presidency because, I'm a bit of a cynic. When you have a prime ministerial system, the prime minister contests from a particular area which can be preponderantly, drawn from community X. But a president elected by the island as a whole has to be conscious of the votes of all communities. And therefore I prefer the presidency. But certainly we need the 17th Amendment back, and we need those independent commissions, because with an independent police commission, and when there was one, the police behaved a little differently. Then the police would be unafraid to uphold the law. They wouldn't be thinking, look, are these guys connected? They just don't give permission because there would be a disturbance of the peace. Now, that was obvious, that in that situation, you allow a well-known Islamophobic group to go in there, have a rally, and be addressed by a demagogue, albeit in robes, that there would be some consequence. You might as well give people cans of kerosene to light a fire, because that's what happened. Now, I want to know who gave permission and why for that rally. Well, the violence, early it was a clash, some stones were thrown, or I don't know, whatever. The violence took place after the rally.
Well, I'm sure in the coming days we will have answers to these questions, or at least we hope that we will have answers to these questions. Dr. Jayathilaka, I'd now like to move on to another topic, which of course this has implications on, which is the pending international investigation and the various stances that the different parties here at home have taken. Now, the government initially, after saying that it will not cooperate, that this is in principle that this resolution and the investigation is in violation of the principles of international law, has now decided to put this matter to Parliament. It's a good thing, I suppose, that the executive has recognized the existence of a legislature. But what do you make of
better late than never.
What do you make of this move?
Well, I think it's a smart move on the part of the president. I also think that it's the right move, because I remember when the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord was signed and the Indian peacekeeping force deployed in Sri Lanka, there was a massive outcry that it had not been brought to Parliament, that all of this was done behind the back of the Parliament. That was true. That criticism was valid. The Accord was never ratified by Parliament. It should have been. In any other country, even in the United States, with its powerful executive, any treaty has to be ratified by the legislature. So, in this matter of the international inquiry and how the state should treat with it, I think it is a good thing that it is being debated in the House. So, I don't doubt that the government was engaging in some fast footwork politically, but whatever its motivation, it is good that it is out in the open, because all of this will be in the Hansard. It will be watched by the country on television. Future generations will know what stance each party took on a matter of such, I would say, historic national significance as the international inquiry.
Dr. Jayatillaka, the government has said that, well, initially it said that it would not allow this international investigation team that is being put together by the OHCHR to come to Sri Lanka to conduct the investigations. Ambassador Arya Singh, the permanent representative in Geneva at the moment, said, I believe last week, that reports have emerged regarding which question the credibility of an official who was appointed to coordinate this investigation, Ms. Sandra Bedas. I hope I got the pronunciation right. She was previously assigned to UNMISS in South Sudan, and it was the South Sudanese army that had raised certain allegations against her and then expelled her from that country. Of course, Madam Pillay came back to defend her staff employee. What I wanted to ask you, Dr. Jayatillaka, is have you encountered Ms. Sandra Bedas in your career as a diplomat?
No, I haven't. And I would have thought that it would have been wiser for the Office of the High Commissioner to pick somebody who wasn't as controversial or when blotted a copybook as obviously has Ms. Bedas. Well, but they made their choice. Now, what's interesting and what your viewers should know is that one of my successors, Ambassador Tamara Kurunagam, worked for the Office of the High Commissioner. And way back in the 80s when President Rajapaksa, then an opposition MP, worked together with her on human rights issues in Geneva. Now, because of her intimate awareness of how the Office of the High Commissioner functions, Ambassador Kurunagam was able to secure a fax that had been sent by a top official of the Office of the High Commissioner about the resolution against Sri Lanka in 2012. Now that showed that there was complete bias and complicity and behind the scenes skullduggery. So Ambassador Kurunagam went public with this, and she was going to bring it to the Council and inform the rest of the member states as to what was going on with the office in relation not only to Sri Lanka but therefore in relation to various country situations. And she would have been backed by a coalition which would have then raised the issue of the neutrality or otherwise of the top officials and staffers of the Office of the High Commissioner, which is different from the Human Rights Council. The office reports to New York, to the Secretary General. Now, when Ambassador Kurunagam attempted that, she was prevented from doing so by the Foreign Ministry of Sri Lanka, by the officials, now top officials and monitors and so on and so forth. And she was replaced. She was replaced, and her successor, our present ambassador, issued a statement saying that Sri Lanka has nothing to do with that earlier, with Ambassador Kurunagam's effort to raise these questions. Now, had we proceeded with what Ambassador Kurunagam was trying to do in 2012 and exposed the bias of the office, then it would have been more difficult to appoint people like this. Now when we protest, it looks like we are protesting because we are in trouble. I mean, we were in trouble then, but not as much trouble as we are now.
But this is what I don't understand. Why would the Ministry of External Affairs pass up an opportunity to expose bias on the part of the Office of the High Commission? Isn't that what they're trying to claim anyway?
Well, Nadeem, we are talking about an administration, or call it, I don't know, what do you want to call it, an establishment, a power structure.
If the fact is that you've got a certain goal, and you've got an avenue to get to that goal, and you choose to pass up that avenue, that's not very good administration, is it?
Well, Nadeem, look, what we're facing now is a war crimes inquiry by the Office of the High Commissioner. There was a very serious attempt to do this immediately after the war, hence the special session on Sri Lanka. Of the resolution that the West had drafted called on High Commissioner Pillay to come down to Sri Lanka and visit the conflict zones, and in 6 months present a report on her findings. Now, she would have been down here before the blood dried on the battlefield if that resolution had gone through. Sri Lanka defeated that resolution then. Now the same effort is actually knocking at the door of Sri Lanka. I mean, it was defeated in Geneva by Sri Lanka, and now it's knocking at the door 5 years later. Now, how did that happen? One of the reasons was that the Sri Lankan establishment, including the foreign ministry, dismantled the defenses and scrambled the success that we had obtained in defense of the country then. And we held the line 10,000 miles away from Colombo. Now it's here on our shores, and we are debating in Parliament whether we should let these guys in or not. Now, tell me the logic of that. There is no logic.
That's what I suppose I should be asking you.
Yeah, well, I would say that it's completely irrational. I don't see why, if you won in a place an important battle in your defense, that you should want to upend that. And after that, what happened? We lost 3 times. 2012, 2013, 2014. The consequence of that is the international inquiry that is now knocking at our doors. Now, I think that there's a serious problem of cognition on the part of the decision makers. And the result is that they and all of us and the armed forces are in very serious trouble.
Now, this is one of the key ministries. I mean, in every country, you have the interior, the external, defense, and finance. Those are the key. Those are the end. Those make up the engine. So you think that the decision makers in this case are the people at the very top of the executive. So then, does it display? I mean, we're saying there are fundamental flaws with international law, that these resolutions are being passed against Sri Lanka and they're flawed, they're against the principles of international law, they're unethical, they're immoral, and all this stuff. But doesn't it display fundamental failures in our foreign policy machinations?
Yes, Nadeem, but sometimes when you take a comparative perspective, it's useful. There was a fairly recent book on Prime Minister Manmohan Singh by one of his staffers, Sanjay Barua. And he draws the distinction between what he calls Manmohan Singh 1, the administration, the first administration, and MS2, that's the second administration. In the first 5 years of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, India did very well. The economy did very well. The problems were during MS2, Manmohan Singh 2, the second administration. I would say the same thing about the present administration. I see the first term as having been the best, in which the administration cohered. That's the time that I served in Geneva. I had direct contact with the executive, with the president, and that's how things were strategized. It was just sort of one hop. There were problems with the foreign minister and the foreign secretary and so on, but still we were able to obtain that success. But then you have Mark II. That is the post-war regime. The post-war regime is contoured significantly differently from the wartime administration. And after the elections of early next year, we will have probably Mark III, which will be still different, more different from Mark II. The problems are in Mark II, because in Mark II, or Model 2, I think the relative autonomy of the president in terms of making decisions has either been encroached upon or has been voluntarily ceded by the executive. I mean, we talk about the lack of devolution of power. I think there has been the wrong kind of devolution. And I think, or rather I know, that those who hold a veto on foreign policy and strategic decisions, and therefore really run the foreign ministry from backstage, are those who neither have the experience nor the education to manage international politics and international relations. So that is the problem. The president's own instincts when it comes to international relations are good. But he has now allowed his autonomous decision-making capacity to be shrunk. He listens far more and relies far more on those other than himself who know less about international relations than he does. I mean, he was in Geneva in the 1980s. He knows the terrain, which is why, I mean, it was on that basis that he picked me and he sent me there and we did the job. But now he allows himself to go with the consensus in his establishment.
So
and the consensus...
You're saying, what you're basically saying is that there's a sense of dependence on
there's a sense of dependence on people who are much less smart than he is. And that is not going to do him or the country any good. It hasn't. And that's why we have declined. I mean, there's been a huge retreat from the Battle of Geneva, Geneva 1, in 2009, which we won handsomely by more votes than the Americans have got against us for 3 years. And then Geneva 2, 3, 4, where all of which we lost. Now, look at the logic or illogic of this, Nadeem. We won in 2009, but the government decided to change the Sri Lankan representation there. We drew the match in September 2011 when Tamara Gunanagam was there. So, the team that won the game was dismissed. The team that drew the game in September 2011 was dismissed. And the team in Colombo and in Geneva that lost 3 times has been left untouched. Now, go figure.
Food for thought on that note. We'll go in for a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll look at the stance that other parties have taken with regard to this resolution. Should the government cooperate? Well, the opposition thinks so. When we come back. Welcome back to the program. When we left off, we were talking about the stance that other parties have taken with regard to the UN Human Rights Council resolution on Sri Lanka and the impending international investigation. Dr. Jayathilaka, I'd like to start off with the statement that has been issued by the opposition, which says that the government should cooperate with this investigation.
You mean the main opposition party?
The main opposition
the
party.
UNP.
Well, the main opposition party, the United National Party, has issued a statement saying the government should cooperate with it. And there's a line of there's a subtext there which says, if you have nothing to hide, then you shouldn't worry about it. But do you think that the government should cooperate with this investigation simply because it has nothing to hide?
Well, Nadeem, if I thought so, I wouldn't have fought against this in 2009 May and secured a hands-up majority for Sri Lanka. I continue to think in the same way that I did then. Because I can't think of a single country in our situation which has submitted itself or has been sought to be investigated internationally. Sri Lanka is, however flawed and distorted, is a democratic state. The war was waged by an elected government. It was waged within Sri Lanka's legitimate international borders. There was no implications for world peace or regional peace. It was fought against a militia recognized as terrorist.
Even fascist.
And given plenty of chances at the negotiating table. And the war was won. It's over. And it's been 5 years. Now, we don't have the peace that we deserve, but there are no large-scale killings going on. Now, I don't know of any country in that situation, in that category, that has been investigated. Of course, there was an investigation into the Gaza war, but that's because the Palestinians are an occupied people under international law, and Palestine is an occupied territory. This is under international law. Sri Lanka didn't wage a war in any territory deemed an occupied territory by international law and the UN Security Council. There have been investigations.
But given that you mentioned Israel, now there was an investigation mandated by the UN Human Rights Council into Israel.
Yeah, I was there.
And you were there. You've, of course, I forgot that you have had past dealings with the state of Israel, let's say.
Yeah, in Paris as well.
So,
UNESCO recognized Palestine as a member.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you, you mentioned Israel. Now, Israel they face this investigation. They don't seem to have had any adverse effects. So why should Sri Lanka be afraid of this investigation?
Very simple answer. We ain't Israel. I mean, look, Israel has an open-ended commitment from the world's sole superpower, the United States. We don't. China is not the United States. One of the reasons for that is a very powerful Jewish lobby which plays a role in American society and politics. There is no singular Buddhist lobby which Obama or Hillary Clinton have to worry about politically.
There's no Sri Lankan lobby, yes.
Well, I don't know. Maybe there is one. I think we've outsourced it. There's certainly a Tamil diaspora lobby, Mr. Rudra Kumar, and they seem to be doing okay.
They seem to be doing pretty good jobs.
Israel is also the most powerful military entity in the entire region, in their neighborhood. They are a covert nuclear power. Sri Lanka is not, well, Sri Lanka is more powerful than the Maldives militarily, but we are certainly nowhere close to being anything like our closest neighbor in terms of military power. One last thing. That inquiry into Israel's Gaza war was headed by Justice Richard Goldstone. Now, I was there when the council decided on Justice Goldstone. I've shared a platform with Justice Goldstone here. Justice Goldstone is Jewish. Justice Goldstone was therefore susceptible to social and community pressures.
In spite of those community pressures, though, the Goldstone report did have...
yeah, the Goldstone report was okay, but sometime later he recanted and he said, look, it was very close to his niece's bar mitzvah, the ceremony, and there he was lobbied by the community. Now, last time I looked, neither Sandra Bedas nor Dame Sylvia Cartwright, OBE, former Governor General of New Zealand, were singular Buddhists. So I don't think that they are likely to be lobbied on behalf of the Sri Lankan state by their communities, and therefore that they are likely to recant on any report. And certainly the High Commissioner Designate on Human Rights, Prince Zaid of Jordan, is not a singular Buddhist. So I don't think we have any Justice Goldstones in there. Nothing. So we are not going to get the same outcome.
So we should be worried about this investigation far more than it.
Oh, we should, but we shouldn't let them in either. We should be worried. It's very serious.
If they do, if Parliament, highly unlikely, does decide to let this investigation banner into the country, where does it go from there?
Well, Nadeem.
What are the? I'm sure our viewers would also like to know what do the investigators actually do on the ground?
Well,
is it like a presidential commission on missing persons, for example? Do they go from district to district?
Well, the report went missing.
Yes, where they go from district to district in the evidence.
Like you mean the Udalagaman Commission as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they can do anything they want. If you allow a team in here, now this is not to say that there won't be an investigation held overseas. They plan that. But if you allow them here, they can go to every battlefield, they can go to every military camp, they can summon any military officer or soldier they want, serving or retired, and they can grill them about every action, every battle, every mortar round, every written instruction, every record, every dead LTT. Now, I don't know of any country where an army has won a war, or even one in which they have, which voluntarily allows that kind of treatment. I mean, you really have to be a colony, or you have to have a colonial mentality to want to cooperate with that kind of investigation. We know what happened with the WMD investigation in Iraq. If they don't find what the sponsors want, then they pull the team out or they ignore what the team says.
And the sponsors will go for what they want.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
go for the jugular.
Look, I mean, you asked me the question about the main opposition party having called on the government to cooperate with the inquiry. My answer to that is this. Hasn't the main opposition party read the statement made in the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva by the permanent representative of India when the vote came up on OP10? OP10 is operating paragraph 10, which is to do with the international inquiry, because the audiences might forget. When the resolution was passed this March, there were 3 votes. The last one was on the resolution as a whole, but there were 2 other motions brought by the Pakistani permanent representative, my old friend from the Battle of 2009, Ambassador Zamir Akram. Now, those 2 resolutions, one was about the finances for this probe, but the more important one was to
strike OP10.
To strike OP10, to retain the rest if you want, but you move against the international inquiry. Now, not only did our traditional friends, who some say are sort of imperfect democracies or non-democracies, support us, most importantly, India, which abstained on the whole resolution, voted with us and against the international inquiry. And it didn't just do so. It made a strong and detailed statement as to why the international inquiry is wrong. Now, doesn't the United National Party have at least the same love for Sri Lanka that the Indian permanent representative, let alone the Pakistani permanent representative, in Geneva displayed in March? Because he gave all the reasons why there should be no international inquiry and why it is wrong. And nobody in the region supported that international inquiry. Nobody in Asia supported, not even Japan. I mean, South Korea, okay. Only South Korea. And that's because there was a problem. I mean, the North Koreans are behaving badly and there were some military exercises with the Americans scheduled. Even Japan didn't say cooperate with the international inquiry. Yasushi Akashi said the international inquiry is counterproductive when he came over. Now, the UNP says cooperate with the international inquiry. Are we then to assume, and logically we should, that a UNP government, if ever there were to be one, under this leadership, would cooperate with the international inquiry? Because that's the only conclusion you can draw.
But realistically, based on the politics of the UNP, do you think that if there was a UNP government, they would realistically comply with the international investigation?
These guys, yes, I do. The reason is
the present leadership.
No, the reason is this. There is nothing that the international investigation wants to do to the Sri Lankan armed forces that the present UNP leadership didn't do in Atharugiriya when they raided a safe house of the Directorate of Military Intelligence, where there was a team which was tracking and killing LTT leaders. A Sri Lankan unit, legitimate unit. And then those people were taken, those officers, I met those officers. Despite the fact that the Army Commander Lionel Balagala said, look, these guys are perfectly legit, these are our people, these are our boys that are tracking the tigers in the jungles. Despite the fact that the then military spokesperson, General Sanat Karnaratna, who defended Elephant Pass, upheld the integrity of those officers and men, the UNP government of that day hauled those people into custody and took statements and thereby exposed much of the intelligence gathering network in the tiger controlled areas. Now, that government, it's the same person who still leads UNP. I'm sure he's going to cooperate with the international inquiry if he is voted into office. And I think that's the conclusion we have to derive. But, Nadeem, in defense of the UNP, and I'm not joking, I have to say this, I don't know when that statement was discussed in the UNP. You know, if you issue a statement on something so important, you have to summon your working committee or your parliamentary group, preferably both. You debate it, you discuss it, what is the stand we're going to take, how do we balance these considerations.
The Leadership Council.
Leadership Council. I mean, there's an election coming up. How is this going to play? I mean, look at it even from that point of view. Forget principle. I don't know where and when and who by this decision was taken. I mean, at least
Because it is a main decision. That's going to have far-reaching consequences. I mean, this is going to have consequences at the ballot box.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if they abstain on a resolution, they or anybody else for that matter, abstain on a resolution that is opposed to the international inquiry, you might find that the voters abstain from voting for them.
Well, that's an interesting take on the UNP's stance as well. I'd like to now move on to the Tamil National Alliance, and
hopefully the JVP as well.
They've welcomed, let's call them the more minor parties, the TNA first and then the JVP. The TNA has welcomed this international investigation, and on the other side, we also saw recently Chief Minister C.V. Vigneswaran telling the Hindu in India that he doesn't think that the Modi government and the Tamil Nadu government of Jayalalitha will be at variance with regard to their stance on Sri Lanka. This is with that investigation just around the corner as well. How do you see this playing out when this is taken up in Parliament? How do you think the TNA is going to?
Well, Nadeem, I mean, realistically, I don't think that anyone can expect the TNA not to welcome the international investigation. I mean, of course they would. I don't see anything really wrong in that. What I do have a problem with is when my old former comrade, Mr. Suresh Premachandran, tells the newspapers that the TNA will actively mobilize itself to gather evidence and submit it to the international inquiry. Now that is a different ballgame. And now I'm not saying that the government should do something stupid like it usually does and arrest these the TNA people.
Well, the cabinet spokesperson has said
I know,
that anyone who provides evidence will be dealt with.
One of my friends is a very well-known international figure, Professor Richard Falk, emeritus professor in international law at Princeton, and until very recently the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories. He did a brilliant piece on President Obama's recent West Point speech on US military strategy and so on. And he summarized President Obama's stance as saying, don't do stupid stuff. Right? I think that's really what I would like to tell the Sri Lankan government. And I have been saying it for a couple of years now. Don't do stupid stuff.
Please, don't be silly.
Yeah, I mean, don't play into the hands of the bad guys. So I'm not saying that any action should be taken against the TNA, but the TNA should also think about something. And it's not about Sinhalese or Tamils or whatever. Think about the Sinn Féin, the IRA. At no point did the Sinn Féin call for an international inquiry on what the British Army and worse still the Protestant paramilitary militias and the police, the Ulster Defence Forces, the militias, the Ulster Police, the Constabulary, what they did. They didn't call for an international inquiry. Actually, they haven't even called for a national inquiry. Now, is it that the Sinn Féin, which actually is doing much better politically than most parties, is it that they don't care about justice or the sentiments of their people? No. They are responsible and mature political players. They were young men with a lot of emotion, but they don't do their politics on the basis of emotion. They don't do their politics in Ireland on the basis of what somebody in an Irish pub in New York, half drunk, would be saying, because there's a lot of romantic Irish nationalism in New York and in the United States, but mostly in New York. That's the diaspora, the Irish diaspora, the Irish Catholic diaspora. And they supported the war. But that's not how the Sinn Féin does its politics. The TNA should learn from some serious people, like the Sinn Féin. I'm not saying they should listen to the Sri Lankan government. This is not the way to play it. At least they should have heard of the good cop, bad cop play acting. Let whoever is doing the international investigation do it. You can even welcome it, but don't get involved. Use that to strengthen your bargaining position or negotiating position. Just don't get into it.
Do you think the TNA is being exploited? Do you think that the TNA doesn't if I were to put it to you this way, would you disagree? That the TNA is now being exploited by forces, maybe in Tamil Nadu, maybe by the diaspora, by the larger diaspora, and that the TNA doesn't really have any decision-making power anymore?
Well, Nadeem, I think it's something different. It's the nature of Tamil politics, which I'm still studying. Why is it that there is no strong moderate alternative in Tamil politics, either here or in the diaspora, which rejects the LTT, not supports the government, but which openly rejects the LTT? There's nobody who says, look, these guys were wrong, they're bad, we have nothing to do with them, and makes a critique. At least doesn't allow their flags in their rallies in the diaspora. And these are people, these are movements in Western democracies. Why don't they model themselves on the British Labour Party or the Conservatives or the French Socialists or the US Democrats? Why don't you have a Tamil party like that? If neither were alive, I think that's the way things would have gone. But even Justice Vigneswaran, mentioning Prabhakaran as a great hero during his election campaign, this is not the way a moderate democratic party should behave. Take the South. I would hardly like to uphold southern political parties as any kind of model, but there was a time when the Sri Lanka Freedom Party was in liaison with the JVP during the worst days of the second insurrection. Mahinda Rajapaksa was one of them who used to demonstrate together with the JVP in a sort of broad patriotic alliance. But when that insurrection was over, I didn't hear the Sri Lanka Freedom Party talking about the great hero Rohan Vijayveera. They just went back to being a moderate nationalist democratic party. They had nothing to do with the insurrection. They would not participate in the commemorative events that the JVP has to commemorate 71 and November 1989. They don't. They might form alliances, at the political level, but you don't have that celebration, that identification. They cut away because these are established democratic mainstream parties, the UNP and the SLFP. But the TNA has not been able to do that. So there's something going on. And Justice Vigneswaran is wrong when he says that Modi and Jayalalitha are on the same page, because Jayalalitha is not talking about the 13th Amendment. There's not a word about the 13th Amendment in her petition. She's calling for Tamil Eelam, she's calling for an internationally sponsored referendum.
She wants to see the national leadership taken to the Hague.
Yeah, the whole genocide thing. That's not what Prime Minister Modi is saying. Prime Minister Modi is calling for the full and expeditious implementation of the 13th Amendment as promised by the Sri Lankan leadership to the Indian leadership during and after the war, and to move beyond that through negotiation. By beyond, he's not talking about Tamil Eelam, he's talking about the redemarcation of the concurrent list and fleshing out, it's known as 13 plus. Now that's what Prime Minister Modi is talking about. It's not what Jayalalitha is talking about. So there again the TNA is reading it wrong.
Well, the reason I asked you this, Dr. Jayatheka, is I recently read on a blog, certainly not peer-reviewed academic journal, maybe not much intellectual discipline at all, but it put forward a very interesting idea that the TNA is a self-destructive entity, that they are ruining all avenues of getting what they want because they are being exploited by these various factions, that the TNA is not going to succeed in having the 13th Amendment implemented or going beyond that in terms of devolution because they are a self-destructive entity. Do you agree?
Well, no, I don't. I think the TNA is far less self-destructive than the United National Party. After all, the TNA got 78% of the vote in the north. And if you take the TNA's electoral performance from 2010, they've scored at the parliamentary, local government, at every level of the political structure, and finally the provincial level. So I think the TNA has been a successful political party electorally.
But not in terms of achieving...
in terms of negotiation, it's not just the TNA. You look at Tamil politics as a whole. Tamil nationalism has not succeeded in war. It looked like they were, but it went very wrong. And it's not succeeded politically. Northern Tamil nationalism, the project has not succeeded politically. I'm not even talking about Tamil Eelam. They tried for Tamil Eelam, it didn't work. Vadikure and so on and so forth, and then the war. It has not even succeeded in fleshing out the 13th Amendment. The reason is that it has never been clear as to whether the 13th Amendment is the framework. So when the government really wants to move below the 13th Amendment and the TNA wants to go beyond, it's very easy for the government, because then you can keep playing games. If the TNA had been anything like the Sinn Féin, as I said, there would have been a functioning provincial council in the north today, and that would have been, a great achievement. I think Mr. Tondaman, I don't mean Arumugam Tondaman, I mean S. Tondaman Senior, is a model of political success, because when he started, what did he see? He had his people disenfranchised. Their votes were removed. They voted in 1947 at the first election. They were very influential. And then they were stripped of their right to vote, Nadeem. But by 1986 he had got all that back. And he was seen as a kingmaker. There is no politician from a minority community today who is treated with the respect
that
friend and foe of all administrations. However powerful those presidents were, they treated Mr. Tondaman. And this man, who saw his people stripped of their civic rights, when he died, Sri Lankan Air Force helicopters threw flowers on his tomb, on his body. I mean, that was the level of achievement. Now, that's politics. And I want to share with you something. I was a little kid. I remember my father, Mervyn De Silva, who died 15 years ago, asking Mr. Tondaman. He asked him, look, Mr. Tondaman, what is the secret of your political success? And Mr. Tondaman used to invite my parents and me for dinner once a month. And there was dosa being made by a master chef, the domestic aide, a lady. And he said, Mervyn, watch that woman make the dosa. You like the dosa? It's excellent, the best ever. Right. Watch her do it. You know the secret of her success? She knows exactly the right moment when to flip it, when to turn it around. That was, he was half joking. Now the TNA does not know.
It's a good political analogy, let's say.
The TNA just doesn't know the timing, when to turn it around.
So basically what you're saying is they're lacking, that there is a lack of maturity in that.
There's a lack of realism. They're mature, they're old, some of them. But there's a complete absence of pragmatism and realism. There's much too much emotionalism.
Dr. Jathalika, before, we're running short of time, so before we wrap up quickly, I want to ask you, the JVP, the stance that the JVP is taking, we've seen some sort of a revival of the JVP since the last election. MP Anukumar Dissanayaka has obviously been a good choice for the party.
Yeah.
And some in the periphery are actually touting him as a possible common candidate.
Yeah.
Maybe not the next one, but in years.
Well, I think he should be a candidate. I don't know about common. I think the JVP should field him as a candidate.
How do you see the stance that the JVP has taken with regard to Sri Lanka's foreign policy and these pending investigations?
Well, I know that they're moving amendments as we speak. I've read them in the newspapers, the amendments, and they're quite fair and reasonable and justifiable and so on. But I'm not sure whether it's the right tactic, because you see, what the government has done, and of course the government is looking for political advantage, but still, the resolution that the government has brought forward is not to solicit support for the government or for the president. It's not, strengthen our great president, hail to the chief, and so on and so forth. No. It, however cunningly, it's worded very cleverly. It is in opposition to the international inquiry. So, the JVP probably is best served by moving the amendments, having them debated, having them aired, speaking on those amendments, having a vote on those, but once, if the amendments are defeated, they still have the issue of the resolution, and the resolution is not for the government, it's against the international inquiry. Now, to abstain on that, or absent oneself, or vote against it, would not be, I think, principled politics in keeping with their own ideology, nor would it be electorally very helpful.
Well, I think the JVP is certainly interesting to watch how they progress from here onwards. They've become quite active, not just on the streets, but
well, they're the only anti-racist political party in Sri Lanka.
Also in Parliament, exactly. Well, Dr. Jathika, unfortunately we're out of time. It would be a pleasure to keep bantering on, but we have to wrap up. As always, it's been very enlightening, and we hope that we've given our viewers as well a sense of perspective and understanding of the issues that our country is facing at the moment. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you again in a fortnight.
Thank you, Nandi.